When you think of American philosophers, who do you think of? Emerson, Thoreau, the pragmatist if you're cool. Who else? Chomsky? Quine? Look, the point is that there aren't many notable American philosophers. Furthermore, are there even any American philosophers that existed before this place actually became the United States? Like, you could make the argument that Thomas Paine was a philosopher, but what about even earlier? Well, it's complicated. There were many intellectuals before 1776, but many of them were also theologians, which kinda makes things muddy, because the differences between theology and the philosophy of religion are not very well laid out. I mean, we all consider people like Pascal and St. Augustine to be philosophers, but most of their work is within the realm of Christianity. I think you can debate the differences between theology and philosophy of religion, but we could also just look at religious ideas with philosophical scrutiny, without having to say we're either doing philosophy or doing theology. Let's just think about interesting ideas in general. With that out of the way, one of the most controversial ideas in many religions is the concept of hell, some eternal place of suffering for those who do not follow a religion and their requirements. And there's one philosopher or theologian who was American before our split from the British, who did contemplate this terrifying place, and that is Jonathan Edwards. So little Jonathan was born in 1703 in Connecticut, the state that, honestly, no one really thinks about. Now this kid was big-brained. At the age of just 11, he wrote an essay about his empirical observation on spiders. And by 13, he was admitted to Yale. I couldn't even do that at age 18. He was a bit of a Renaissance student studying natural history and the sciences, but also studying theology. You know, we often think of the Enlightenment coming in and being at odds with religion, but here we see Edwards embracing the science of the Enlightenment while also maintaining a strong religious lifestyle. Now in the 1730s, when Edward was in his 30s as well, there was this cultural event in America known as the Great Awakening. And it's kinda how it sounds. This was a time of a lot of renewed interest in Christianity and the church. We saw a lot of different denominations coming together focused on converting others. There was a bunch of preaching going on and sermons given, apparently outside as well, so that's a bit nicer than being indoors all day. But something weird was happening. A lot of people heard these sermons and were definitely moved by them, but they didn't feel converted. There was no strong conversion even though people seemed to believe in the Christian faith. It's weird. I guess this makes me wonder how people can live in that in-between state, where they are religiously Christian but don't have faith. But anyways, this apparently was the case where people were experiencing this religious despair. So this was the problem. People were religious, but not religious enough to take that leap of faith in Christ. This led Edwards to give his most famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. It's a bit of a dark sermon that, from what I've heard, is actually read by many students in Christian private schools. I haven't attended one, but if you have, let me know if you're familiar with this work. The sermon starts out with a quote from Deuteronomy 32:35. It's a small quote that simply says, "Their foot shall slide in due time." This passage is supposed to represent the vengeance of God on unbelievers. Now, even though this quote is small, it allows Edwards to make a number of assumptions. For one, it implies that unbelievers are already in danger of falling. It's like you're walking on a tightrope above some spikes. You're exposed to the danger already, but your foot hasn't slipped yet. Secondly, this passage implies that their downfall is of their own volition. No one is necessarily pushing them off, but they're slipping on their own accord. Even though I'd argue slipping isn't really a conscious act, but whatever. Now this next assumption is a bit of a stretch, and it's that the reason they haven't fallen yet is because God is still holding them up. You see, the big takeaway from this sermon is that it's not so much that God is going to force you into hell, but rather He's the only one keeping you from hell. The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. Edwards often gives analogies like this, like he's restraining the forces of hell from swallowing you up, but is holding them at bay for now, kinda like holding the leash of a rabid dog. Now the obvious question is, why does he even bother holding back these forces upon non-believers? If he's so angry and vengeful at them, which he definitely is according to Edwards, then why doesn't he just let them fall? Well, Edwards says it's because it's within his sovereign pleasure, but he doesn't really give a good definition for this. I'd guess that it's to give us a chance to believe, but Edwards is a Calvinist. And look, I'm not very well versed on Christian theology, but if I remember correctly, Calvinists believe in predestination, so how would that play into this? Either way, it's kinda weird to think of God just holding you above the pit of hell being angry at you and not just letting go. Why would he continuously hold us up then? Anyway, the sermon is filled with what sounds like a lot of anger and condemnation, even if Edwards was apparently a soft-spoken speaker. But just reading this sermon, it reminds me of something I think Nietzsche actually talked about, how some Christians might also take pride and joy in the fact that others are going to hell, like a kinda, ha, I won in the end attitude. And while you may get that impression in the first part of the sermon, the second part turns toward a more sympathetic attitude. The use of this awful subject may be for awakening unconverted persons in this congregation. So there's something I've been keeping back. Remember how I said that many religious people weren't converted and felt some sort of religious distress as a result? Well, in George Marsden's book on Edwards, this distress apparently even led some people to commit suicide, including Edwards' own uncle. So as much as we can disagree with Edwards and call him angry and just a fire and brimstone preacher, I'd imagine that he seems to be doing this out of some genuine distress himself. He wants to push those people experiencing religious despair towards conversion. And he's seen what happens when there is no conversion. The sermon then becomes less of a condemnation, but more of a plea of sorrow. It's a call for those unconverted to become converted, in order to escape not just hell, but that religious despair. If we knew that there was one person, and but one, in the whole congregation, that was to be the subject of misery, what an awful thing would it be to think of? If we knew who it was, what an awful sight would it be to see such a person? How might all the rest of the congregation lift up a lamentable and bitter cry over him? Here's the thing. Proselytizing and evangelism can be annoying, and it can be cringy. I mean, we've all probably been approached by someone representing a religion trying to make us believers, and I used to look at them with annoyance, like they're only trying to get you on their side, like it's some sort of team thing. But when I think of Edwards and his motivation for inspiring conversions, it's emotionally understandable. You don't have to agree with him or hell or the entirety of Christianity or any religion for that matter. But pragmatically, if someone believed what Edwards believed, that an unconverted would go to this eternal hell, wouldn't his desire to convert others be at least somewhat emotionally understandable? His desire to save us from what he believes to be both hell and spiritual distress? That's my takeaway, at least. You do not have to agree with the religions that people try to convert you for, but at least in this case, I emotionally understand the motivation. It's a very tricky distinction I'm trying to make here, so let me know if I conveyed it well enough. Anyway, that's Jonathan Edwards. As someone who didn't go to a Christian private school or who just isn't as knowledgeable about theology as others, let me know if you've heard of this guy before. Be sure to like, subscribe, hit the bell, and suggest other forgotten philosophers. And with that, I wish you all a beautiful rest of your day.